The courtroom was freezing, not because of the temperature, but because of the aura of authority and gravity that reigned there.
The dark wooden walls, the rigid benches and the pale lighting gave the place an austere, almost oppressive air.
The echo of quiet discussions and the nervous scratching of pens against paper added to the solemn atmosphere. At the center of this scene stood Judge Clarice Beaufort, a black woman in her 40s, known for her unwavering righteousness and her unfailing impartiality. His gaze, piercing and calculating, passed methodically from one individual to another, capturing the slightest quiver, the slightest hesitation. His face, sculpted by years of discipline and rigor, showed no emotion. Her black dress, falling with severe elegance, reinforced the image of an implacable authority, a woman who had risen through the ranks of a system that had never done her any favors. Since her ascension to the position of Chief Judge of the State Court of Appeals, she had become a key figure in the justice system, respected and feared in equal measure. Her career was marked by fair but firm decisions, and she had built a reputation as an incorruptible magistrate, never letting her emotions interfere with the law. But today something was different. That day, she presided over a case that, at first glance, seemed almost banal. A 13-year-old teenager, Malik Burrell, accused of shoplifting from a luxury jewelry store. A seemingly minor offense, but Clarice knew that this type of accusation could weigh heavily on a black boy, especially a child alone and without resources, in a judicial system that was often merciless towards those in his community. The files were piling up in front of her, but this one gave her a strange feeling. She didn't yet know why. "The court is calling the state's case against Malik Burrell," the clerk announced in a monotone voice. A murmur ran through the assembly as the boy was escorted by a police officer to the dock. He was small for his age, with frail shoulders, as if life had already imposed too much weight on him to carry. His clothes were clean but worn, revealing the instability of his situation. He wore no jewelry, no superfluous accessories, as if he had learned not to attract attention. Yet, despite his tense posture and his nervously clasped hands, his gaze remained fixed and penetrating. A look that Clarice felt like she knew. She frowned imperceptibly, but quickly shook the feeling away. Emotion had no place here. The defense lawyer, a man in his 50s with a face marked by experience, stood up and began his argument with controlled fervor.
Your Honor, my client is a child.
He grew up in difficult conditions, bounced from one temporary home to another, without ever knowing stability. He has no family to watch over him, and he has been left to his own devices since a young age. He paused, letting the weight of his words permeate the room. This theft is not an act of delinquency, but a cry of distress. A cry for help in a world that never gave him a chance.
Clarice listened, impassive.
She had heard hundreds of similar pleas over the years. Lawyers pleading poverty, social injustice, extenuating circumstances. If she'd learned anything in this job, it was that every defendant's story contained some truth and some lie. His role was not to judge their suffering, but their actions. But there was something in that lawyer's voice, in the way he talked about Malik, that resonated differently with her. She slowly lowered her eyes to the file in her hands, her fingers sliding mechanically across the pages. Then she read the full name of the accused.
Malik Burrell.
A shiver, imperceptible but very real, ran down his spine. She didn't react immediately, controlling her expression with the expertise of a woman who had spent her life hiding her emotions. But a slight disturbance crept into her, a feeling that she could not explain. Why did the name sound so familiar? She looked up at Malik, who was now looking directly at her, without blinking. Clarice took a deep breath and, in a measured voice, finally asked the question that would change everything.
Malik, tell me what happened.
The boy remained silent. He looked around him, his brown eyes, huge and worried, scanning the courtroom as if searching for a way out, for support, for an answer. Then, slowly, he looked back at the judge.
An intense look. Deep.
He opened his mouth, hesitated, and finally, in a trembling but firm breath, he uttered these words. "Madam Judge, you are my mother." A brutal, stunning silence fell over the room. The clerk paused his gesture, his pen in the air. The usually imperturbable prosecutor blinked, his mouth parted, unable to hide his amazement. The defense lawyer, although experienced in the most improbable reversals, gave a perceptible start, his hand tightening on his file. In the ranks of the public, a few spectators exchanged forbidden looks. Even the policeman stationed at the entrance straightened up, as if the weight of these words had physically changed the atmosphere. But the one who felt the most violent impact was Clarice. His heart, usually like a clock, skipped a beat. A sudden warmth rose to her chest, a warmth she hadn't felt in years. His breath became short. "Pardon?" she asked, her voice, usually calm and controlled, barely above a whisper. The boy didn't look away. "You are my mother," he repeated, in a more confident voice, as if he was afraid of not being heard the first time. The words still hung in the air, suspended between them, defying all logic, all protocol, all normality. Clarice felt a wave of memories, which she had spent a lifetime burying, rise to the surface with the force of a tidal wave. A hospital. The pungent smell of disinfectant.
The harsh light of the neon lights.
A muffled cry.
A baby, teeny, fragile, barely more than a breath of life.
A choice. The most painful of his entire existence. She remembered that cold room where she had signed papers with a trembling hand, her heart crushed by a mixture of love and helplessness. She refused to hold him. One more second, and she would have given up. She would have cancelled everything. She saw herself again, 27 years old, young and full of ambition, at the dawn of a career that she refused to sacrifice for a life that she could not offer. She told herself it was for her own good, that it would be better elsewhere. She had spent the last 13 years trying to forget. And now this past that she thought was buried stood before her, in the form of a thin and nervous teenager, with eyes too familiar to be a coincidence. She closed her eyelids briefly, desperately trying to regain her composure, to silence the storm within her. When she opened them again, her judge's mask was back in place.
Malik, how?
His voice cracked on that last word. She gripped the armrests of her seat, like a shipwrecked person clinging to a raft. She forced herself to regain control. She was a judge.
A magistrate.
Now was not the time to let private emotions take over. She straightened her shoulders, and in a more controlled tone, declared, "It has nothing to do with this matter." She hoped to close the door.
Close this moment. Return the room to normalcy.
But his own heart refused to follow this logic. And she wasn't the only one. The defense lawyer spoke, his voice vibrating with conviction. "Yes, madam. It has everything to do with this matter." Clarice suddenly turned her head towards him. "Malik was abandoned at birth," the lawyer continued, his voice softer now, almost respectful. "He never knew his mother. He grew up in temporary homes, bounced from family to family, always looking for a home, an identity. He spent his life searching. And today he thinks you are that woman."
Clarice felt the ground heave away beneath her.
She wanted to deny it, to say it was impossible, that it was a mistake, that she never had children. But the truth was there, painful, lurking in the shadows of his past, refusing to be ignored another second. At 17, scared, alone, she gave birth in absolute secrecy. A little boy, fragile, tiny, whom she had only held for a few moments before he was taken away from her. A child that she had offered to another life, convinced that she had neither the means nor the maturity to raise him. She had forbidden herself to think about it again. She had convinced herself that it was for the best. But today, the past that she thought was definitively buried had just come to light, in the form of this boy who stood in front of her, pleading with her with his eyes. She opened her eyes and stared at Malik. "Who told you that?" she asked, her voice hoarser than she wanted. "I found my birth certificate," he replied. He looked down briefly, as if hesitant to continue, before raising his head with determination. "My mother's name was blacked out, but there was a clue, your first name. I searched. I saw your photo. I knew." Clarice felt a crushing weight fall on her chest. Her whole world was crumbling, Every foundation she had built threatened to collapse under the brutal revelation. She was chief judge of the Court of Appeal. A woman respected, admired, sometimes feared. A woman whose authority and intellect were never lacking. But in this moment, she no longer felt like a judge. She didn't even feel like a woman anymore. She simply felt like a mother.
Amoterhu, 13 years ago, made an irreversible choice.
The murmurs in the room intensified, curious and shocked looks fixed on her. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't run away. Not this time. She stood up slowly, her black dress flowing lightly around her. "The hearing is suspended," she declared in a surprisingly controlled voice. Then, without another word, she stepped down from her dais and retired to her private quarters. The room where she usually took refuge had always seemed cold, austere, impersonal. But today it was suffocating. She took off her magistrate's dress in a feverish gesture and leaned against her desk, her gaze lost on the stacked files, as if an answer was hidden there. But there was no answer.
Only regrets.
Her heart was beating so hard that for a moment she thought it was going to explode. Then, a few minutes later, a light noise rang out.
A hesitant hand knocked on the door.
She took a deep breath before answering.
"Come in."
The door opened slowly, revealing Malik. He remained motionless on the threshold, as if he feared that just one more step would collapse this fragile reality that he had just discovered. His gaze sought confirmation, hope. Clarice inhaled again, fought against the knot that tightened her throat, and took a step towards him.
Malik.
His voice broke on this name. She had never said it before. She didn't even know his name was that until today. The boy flinched slightly, his hands trembling imperceptibly at his sides. Then, in an almost inaudible voice, he whispered, "It's true, isn't it?" Clarice could no longer go back. She nodded slowly, unable to speak.
A suspended moment.
Then Malik took the last step.
Hesitant at first.
Then faster, as if he feared she would disappear if the moment lasted too long. And finally, after 13 years of separation, a mother and her son hugged for the first time. Clarice felt the warmth of this body against his, the underlying fragility, the childhood that still clung to him despite adolescence. She passed a trembling hand over her head, as if to reassure herself that he was real. He was. She felt her own tears falling, unable to stop them. The judge was no more. Only Clarice remained, a woman confronted with the error of her youth. And Malik, a son who, despite everything, had found his way to her.